Welcome, everyone, to the How to Write a Book podcast. In today's episode, we talk to Marsha Jacobson, who is the author of The Wrong Calamity, a memoir. She grew up in a small Midwest town, went to college in Boston, and discovered she's a city gal. Now she lives in New York City and is an author, teacher, and writing coach. What I really love about The Wrong Calamity is that it starts off, with a young woman who falls susceptible to someone who is abusive, and then how she starts to overcome that, raise her kids, and escape and then start a whole new life. But even that turns out to have so many hurdles down the way. So just also a little bit of a heads up, we'll be talking a little bit about mental abuse, domestic abuse. So I wanted to give you that warning ahead of time. And also when we talk to Marsha Jacobson, it's such a delight. It's a really cool memoir, and I'm really excited for you to dive in today. All right, thank you so much. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the How to Write a Book podcast, the show that helps you plan, write, and publish your book, even if you're a beginner or just feel like one. Now, for your host, she's written over a dozen books and helps others bring their books to life. Here she is, Maciel.
Hey there, writers. Let's take a beat to talk about a special announcement. So November is your month of transformation. Get a 1-hour coaching session with me by choosing one of these 3 options, or all 3. Option 1, join our Patreon for $1, which will support the show. Option 2, book a $1 coaching session on coach.me. Option 3, leave an Apple Podcasts review. Send a screenshot to my email and get a coaching spot. You can do all 3 and get 3 hours of coaching with me. Find all the links in the show notes. Act fast. This offer is only valid for November to celebrate National Novel Writing Month. Thanks. All right, and welcome back to the How to Write a Book podcast. Today, we're welcoming Marsha Jacobson. Hi, Marsha. How are you doing today?
Hi, Maciel. It's so great to be with you.
Oh my gosh, likewise. Marsha is the author of The Wrong Calamity, a memoir. And Marsha, I have to say, I'm excited to read your book. It sounds gripping, thrilling, and also inspiring. And of course, we're going to dive into it. But a little bit about you, and then of course, I'll throw it over to you. So Marsha grew up in a small Midwest town, went to college in Boston, and discovered that you're a city gal, which I love that. I'm in LA, so I can totally relate. And now you live in New York City as an author, teacher, and writing coach. You've appeared in New York Times, The Visible Ink anthology, and the flash fiction anthology For Sale, Baby Shoes Never Worn. Her memoir, The Wrong Calamity, is her debut book. Previously, you were an executive in corporations and nonprofits and a consultant to those. And today, when you're not writing, you can be found reading in a park or cooking something out of the ordinary in your kitchen while listening to a playlist. I love that. Very relatable. Thank you so much, Marsha, for being here.
Thank you for having me, Maciel.
So I've said a little bit about you, but I know that your memoir, it's capturing your life. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your book?
I will. And I think the two of them are pretty intertwined. So I grew up in a household that absolutely was not abusive, terrible, any of the horrible things that can happen to young kids. But I did grow up, I think, with parents who maybe would have preferred not having kids or not having me as a child. And by the time I went to college, and so where I grew up was in a small town in Indiana, and I went to college in Boston. And by the time I went there, I was kind of ripe to fall, under the spell of someone who would pay a lot of attention to me. And that's exactly what happened. There was an administrator at the college. I did fall under his spell. I ultimately agreed to marry him, even knowing that at the time I said yes, that that marriage was not good for me, but I didn't see any way out. And that really was about, low self-esteem, not feeling like someone who deserved a lot, I think. He wanted to move to Japan. I didn't want to. He said he would go with or without me. I couldn't imagine being abandoned so soon after being married. And I agreed to go with him. That turned out to be one of the most fabulous things that could have happened to me. We stayed for 5 years. My first child was born there. And while I was living there, a chance meeting of a guy who was the CEO of Mattel Toys in Southeast Asia led to his hiring me to do a consulting job at Mattel. And I argued with him about it. I mean, I was in my 20s at the time. And the way I met him is that I was a singer and I had just done a concert and his wife had been my accompanist. And I met him at a party at their house. And it was a full 9 months later that he called me one morning and said, I want you to come and help me out with a problem that I have here at Mattel. And I said, no, you misunderstand. I don't know anything about business. And our conversation at the party had been a lovely conversation. He was telling me about his work, and I was really interested, and I kept asking questions, and anything he said to me, I had another question that I would follow up with. And so 9 months later, when we're having this conversation, I'm like, I don't really know about business. And he got kind of annoyed, and he said, no, you don't understand. You're a natural. And he was talking about the question. He had liked the questions I was asking. And I was so naive, Marcia. He told me how much he was prepared to pay. I didn't know anybody made money, with that many digits. And I said to him, I don't know how to do anything that's worth that much money. But anyway, I did end up taking the job. It was a big problem that he had at Mattel. It was a joint venture, and over a business issue, and I never knew what that business issue was, his Japanese and his Western directors were so divided they wouldn't go in a room together. And he wanted me to bring them back together and able to work together again. And then he would take over on the business issue. And, like I said, I was in my 20s, I had studied psychology and I was a singer and I had taught elementary school. So, it was, I just followed on instinct, and it ended up being a successful engagement. And after that, a number of his board members, who in turn were executives of other companies, they hired me to do, little engagements, all different kinds, at their places. One I loved was working for the International Red Cross in Japan. What was going on at that time is that Western manufacturers of baby formula were advertising and winning over Japanese women who were switching from nursing their babies to formula. And because they were being told it was better. And in fact, I think people will argue with that, but I think most in the healthcare world believe that, what nature provided is the best thing to give our children. And they wanted me to work with them on how to counteract that, that pressure to switch. And the other ones were, working with business. So as I became more successful, unfortunately, my husband became more abusive. And after 5 years, I insisted that we go back home. I had a 2-year-old at that point. I was pregnant with another child. And 2 years later, I left that marriage chased by the police. I grabbed my daughters and we ran away chased by the police. And over time, I'm going to jump through a lot of stages here. I was broke. I was on food stamps. My first husband was, stalking me, making things very difficult. Through a convoluted story, I ended up at the Harvard Business School, and I got my MBA there, and ultimately became self-sufficient. And my former husband, who had just felt like such a menace looming over me, I began to realize was, I had taken care of my daughters. I had, I was providing for us, and I was standing on my own 2 feet, and I was really feeling, myself. I had found myself. Later, I had a terrific career, which weaves in and out of of my book, The Wrong Calamity. And I also made an extraordinarily wonderful second marriage, really a glorious marriage. And I was so happy. And many years later, he was already in his 60s. My second husband, recovered memories that he had buried in his childhood of having been terribly abused. And his PTSD overcame our marriage. We were both so heartbroken about it. We tried so hard to stay together, but we just couldn't. And the rest of the story is, how I was shattered. It affected I lost my marriage. I lost my career. I lost a lot of friendships. I mean, it was devastating. And the rest of the memoir is sort of how I regained my footing and found myself again, and that's the story.
Yeah, that's powerful. When I was reading the description of your book, and it's almost exactly as you told it, it's going from one thing to the next, and it's almost like from worse to worse to worse. And I was like, oh my gosh, how did Marsha pull herself out of this, And I want to ask, I'm sure when you go back and you recollect everything that's happening, it can be hard for a lot of people to push through those memories, let alone write them, right? Mm-hmm. How did you tackle that? When did you decide I'm going to write a book about this?
Well, I think let me break that into two parts.
Yeah.
I think there's two questions, mm-hmm. two threads of an answer that I can give you. The origin story of this book is just how it came to be is, I think was not the typical one. I didn't set out to write a memoir. In fact, I set out being adamantly against writing a memoir. I had just moved to New York City. I had lived in Boston at that point for more than 40 years, Tokyo for 5 years, and I had just come on my own to New York City. And I was applying to be in a playwriting workshop, which felt like a very New Yorky thing to do. And, I had come looking for sort of bigger pond, more oxygen, new ways to engage with things. And I had to answer the question, write about yourself in 100 words. And I found that extremely difficult. One of the things that happened is when I was at Harvard Business School, I had an accident that left me with a bad back injury, and I spent an entire semester of the 2 years. I spent a quarter of the half of my last year in the hospital and unable to go to classes, and ultimately having surgery. And it's sort of a long story, but in the end, I graduated on time with my degree, and I had packed that into this 100-word summary, and it just didn't work. And my daughters are both very good writers, and one of them was reading a version of it, and when I showed her the final version, she said, "Oh, it's really a shame you had to take out the Harvard story. It is so central to your life, but I see why you had to take it out." And I submitted this 100-word this application. But I kept thinking about what my daughter said, because I didn't see that story as central to my life. I saw other things as central to my life, but she knows me so well. And I thought, boy, if she thinks that, I'm going to write about this story, and I'm going to set the story straight, And I wanted to write a personal essay about it. And I did. And then I was writing another personal essay about something else and about something else. And along the way, I decided I was committed. I was going to write a collection of personal essays. Very fortunately, I was accepted into a writer's workshop group run in her living room by Joyce Johnson, an author who has won so many awards. Her memoir, Minor Characters, won a National Book Critics Circle Award. She's won an O. Henry for fiction. The New York State, the State Department of the U.S. had sent her to Russia as part of an exchange of artists, trying to prevent the Cold War through personal relationships. Spoiler, it didn't prevent the Cold War, but it's quite an honor. And she was the one who just kept insisting, forget about these essays. You have to write a book. This wants to be a memoir. And finally, she and I have become friends, and we laugh about this, but finally, kind of to get her to stop, I said, fine, I'll try it. And she was right. And once I started writing the memoir, I didn't stop. It was so clear. I never looked back. That's what it had to be. Your question about the emotions is a different one. By the time I was writing with Joyce, that part was the part of my life that it involved my first marriage, which was, traumatic to be in, traumatic to leave. It involved this, this health emergency when I was in school. I already had enough distance from that it was not hard for me to write it. And I was able to, use this writing technique of just getting it all on the page and then going back and editing. And I was able to be writerly about it, find the word that would take the place of two sentences and would be just right, what didn't need to be here. I thought I had enough distance from the second part of that book, the second marriage, the losing the second marriage, and I thought I had enough insight on my own path to becoming sure-footed a second time, that I could write about it. And I discovered neither of those were true. Neither of those was true. Sometimes I would be writing with tears running down my face, and I wrote the entire, that part of the book and trashed it. And I went in to write that second part of the book twice. Finally, on the third time, I had the distance. I had my own thoughts clarified so that I understood what the arc was and what I wanted to do with that half of the book. And that, I'll bookmark that and come back at it in a second. But, and then I was able to write that part of the book and really get into the writing and the editing and, how to paint the arc and what was my through line. Now I will say I was 7 years writing that book. So this was not quick. Yeah. You can count whether it was 6 years because during the lockdown, I just couldn't get into the zone, and 6 years, 7 years, that's how long it took me to write. I say 7. That's how long it took me to write the book. Yeah.
So you were able to kind of blast through that first part, regarding your first marriage, but the second part was a lot more like strenuous for you.
I wouldn't say I blasted through. I mean, by the time I was working with Joyce, I had taken courses in memoir writing and essay writing. I had been in a number of extremely valuable writing groups, workshopping groups. So those pieces had been well edited, well worked. And I would say that, there was 3 years of writing in that part, which is more than half of the book. It's probably about 2/3 of the book, but, it wasn't blasting through it. What happened, the second part was getting emotional distance from it. And I don't really know, like the mechanism, but why that worked. But after writing it several times and getting into the story more than one way, and at one point I realized that I was writing, that I had my art, I had it structured the way I wanted. It was where I wanted it to be, and then I could start editing. And one of the things that happened is along the way I had been giving readings of excerpts from the book, some public readings. And I thought that I had the book finished at one point. And a woman came up to me after a reading. I don't know her. I didn't know her. She came up to me and she said this remarkable, it actually still gives me goosebumps. She said, all the details are different, but you were telling my story. And now I have faith that I'll get through this okay. And I really do have goosebumps.
Wow.
And I mean, the first part of that, like all the details were different, but it was my story. I mean, what does any writer want but to be able to write their story and have others relate to it? And this was right there. But the now I have faith part, I suddenly felt like I had an imperative, I don't know if moral is the right word, but moral obligation is how I felt it, to properly give voice to the often misunderstood lived experience of grief and pain, and resilience, what it takes to be resilient. And I realized that I'd left out some things that didn't reflect beautifully on me. I had kind of pulled some punches, and I had kind of a Hallmark card ending to the book. And it was her comment that opened my eyes to that fact. And I realized, no, if people are going to get inspiration from this book, and this woman clearly had, I have to be very honest. And I went back in, and this, I would say, added 1.5 years. I mean, there's a reason it took so long. Because I had to make it more clear. I didn't want any reader to think, oh, I can do this, and then feel, oh, that book was a sham, or, she has some superpower I don't have, or, anything like that, because I have no superpowers, believe me.
Yeah. And I mean, that is such a powerful thing to do, is when you're writing a memoir. And actually, I don't think 7 years is too long. I mean, when you're trying to capture, decades into a short time. So it sounds like that was a really good length of time. So it's important to shine light as much as you can, going through the vulnerabilities, going through the transparency. And that's something that, like, I've discussed, happens a lot in Memoir, but also on the show, is, sometimes you're going to hit something, or it's going to hit you, and you got to be open about that, because that's where that grit comes from, showing up to the page, when things get hard, when things aren't so pretty. So, I mean, that's amazing that you recognize that and you went back. Now, spacing those items, now you're, I'm going to kind of shine light differently, like you said, maybe not the Hallmark ending. Did that, like, change the process for you in any way, or your emotions toward it?
No, it didn't change the emotions for it.
Because sometimes, like, you're writing, and you're kind of writing on the surface. You're like, okay, well, this happened, and this happened, and this happened. And then you go to the hard parts, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is painful for me. This is hard for me to bring out. Now the page looks scary. Sometimes that can happen.
I see what I understand what you were asking. No, I think by then I had gone past that stage. And interestingly, to me, it surprised me that I really had to come up with, it was the curating. It's like, I need this to be more honest. I need people to, I didn't sail through it. This version gives the impression that I sail through it. Now, I will say that some of my, beta readers, they didn't feel that way, but I knew that it was harder than I had portrayed on the page. So now it was, but I think emotionally I was ready to write. I had been already past that point. And so it was about the curating. What examples do I give to show it? And from that, there were other books that I got inspirations from, and and once I saw some writer techniques that I hadn't yet had in hand, then I was able to do it. So if anybody says to me, what's the most important thing about writing, I say reading,
Love that. 100% read.
Yeah.
You mentioned something that I want to ask. So you had some beta readers. What was that process like for you?
Well, I may be throwing that term around, too loosely. when I first started writing that very first, the personal essay that I wanted to write, which feels now like 100 years ago, I had had a business career for so long, and I had done an enormous amount of business writing. And when I started to write that first essay, I could not lose my business voice. Mm-hmm. And so I went and took some courses, as I think I mentioned, in personal essays and in memoirs. And finally I had just my voice, my natural voice of who am I, when I'm not being just the facts ma'am business person, and I'd always stick to the facts, but it's a different thing. So it was what situations will I put in there to make it clear? I wasn't going to work to say, no, I mean, I was really, really sad and for a really, really long time. That doesn't do anything. Right. It was what particular examples, like what situation where I was sort of coming along and feeling better and working again and socializing again, and then some zinger flies in and, somebody says something I'm not expecting and I'm caught unaware, or there were friends who wanted so much to be there for me. And in the very early days, I would just talk their ear off about how miserable I was, or something like that. And so I started describing my actions. I remember I'll give you just one example. There was a woman who had just lost her husband around the time that I had lost my second husband to divorce, but her husband had died. And they had both been very good marriages. And she was calling me all the time, way too often. And she was intent on being the most aggrieved. I mean, she would be saying, well, at least your husband isn't dead, things like that. Mm-hmm. And I said to her, right after it had happened, the divorce had happened. And I just was so uncharitable to her. I mean, she was a grieving widow. And I said to her, I don't think either of us wants to win that competition, and I ended the call. And then for the rest of the day, I was storming around, sort of screaming at her in my head. I was like, your husband isn't walking around the earth not even giving you a thought. You can read your love letters and they still make sense. You can still trust them, and I wanted to win the contest after all, and so just putting in tiny little episodes like that probably took 2 or 3 sentences, maybe 5, I don't know. And, but just by way of showing people it's hard, and all we can do is what we can do at any given point. But then by mentioning a lot of those things, I also had touch points where I would be able to say, now I was smiling again. Now someone said this to me and it didn't throw me for a loop. And I had also talked along the way of, getting out of that marriage, getting through Harvard, getting self-sufficient and whatnot. There had been a couple of obstacles I had faced, and the way I got out of them was telling twice 2 big lies. And I had left those out. And I decided that they had to go in. And by the time I get to the end of the book, before the end of the book, I'm really reflecting on what was the process and and what was my roadmap, and what are my reflections. And some of them were, when I felt cornered, the only thing I could think of doing was lying. And that happens. When we feel cornered, maybe the only thing we think of doing is eating an entire box of chocolates. I mean, these things happen. And what's important is, what have we learned? What might we help others learn, avoid having to experience on their own? And what do we do personally from now moving forward? I'm not gonna get through life lying. I'm not a liar.
Yeah.
So
I think it's so important, when you reflect like that, then you kind of look at yourself anew. You're like, oh, all right, like you said, I'm not a liar. All right, so I had to add those in. I'm not a liar. And, maybe at that time it brings a whole swarm of emotions, but then you come with this new identity or a refreshed identity.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Now, I definitely had one question that I wanted to ask about your book. So why is it called The Wrong Calamity?
I think that's the question I get asked most often.
It's very catchy, like, oh, The Wrong Calamity. This is, I was like, why? Why is that?
Right, because the immediate comeback is there any such thing as a right calamity? And I think there isn't. Readers are telling me that as they read the book, the title became clear to them. And there is a very literal take on the title, which is that when my second husband started having PTSD and whatnot, I shouldn't say and whatnot, it's not a minor thing, it's a terrible thing, PTSD. And imagine that all of a sudden in your adulthood you discover that the entire childhood you thought you had was not the childhood you had, and you have to absorb that and make peace with that. But I've lost my track of what we were talking
Oh, we're talking about the title. I do that a lot.
I know. Yes, thank you. Sorry. He and I had worked together, and when we reconnected years after that, socially, he had just lost his wife and was grieving. He was a widower, and when things started changing, his personality started changing, and he started reacting to things in ways that weren't my sweet husband. I assumed that he was, that he had this terrible calamity in his life, and it was the death of his wife, and that we carry those things with us. And I happily cut a lot of slack, for him, because I understood that as time went on, it became clear that was not the calamity that we were dealing with, and that this one, we weren't going to be able to change the trajectory of where this was going. And there were other calamities as well, because other family members were drawn in, and, I'm not the first to say that trauma is contagious, and it can go through generations. It can go from person to person. And when you think back about, our forebears and how do people become who they are? My own parents, why were they not warm parents? And I come to some insight about that, and that's there too. I mean, over time, your insights get deeper and more layered. So I think it was, the title is on the one hand extremely literal in that one case, but on the other hand, there are lots of layers of calamities there that affected a lot of people. So,
yeah. And one last question. I was curious about this question. You're talking about generational trauma. How did your daughters handle either release of your book? It sounds like they're very supportive. So, and we know we're all about support here. So I just was curious, what did they think about your memoir, and how did they support you?
So let me say that I did give this memoir to my daughters to read before it was before I was submitting it. And I said to them, let me know if there's anything in here that I've written about you, that you're uncomfortable with. And neither of them had any changes that they asked for. There's a different kind of process too with a memoir, and I had already gone through it. It took me a long, long time, even while I was writing it, to ask myself how I felt about making this be public. And, it's all on the page. And I'm thinking like, yes, I'm ready to go public with this. Oh, wait a minute. My students, my clients. I mean, like, and by the time I finished writing it, and in part because of, not just that one woman who made that comment in a reading, but, people were hearing, we're finding inspiration in it already. I made peace with that. I was ready for that. But, there are other family members who are people out in the world and they're in their own circles. And from a writing point of view, I felt an obligation to stick to my story, not their story, not his story. I had a wonderful, just magical opportunity to spend time with another 5 or 6 writers, and the author Adam Gopnik, who writes a lot for the New Yorker but has published many, many books, at a writers' conference that I went to. I drew a lucky straw, and there were like 5 or 6 of us, just sitting at a table chatting. And in some of his memoirs, his kids are mentioned. And someone asked him, it might have been me, I don't remember, asked him, like, how do your kids feel about this? And he said, well, first of all, they read it, and if there's anything they don't want, they take it out. So I had already done that, and I was really happy to hear that. And then he said, the other thing is, I don't develop them as characters. They are very undeveloped characters. You can't tell one from the other. I really, they come in and out only when something that, a scene that they're involved in it takes the plot in another direction, only when something really matters. And I had this great sense of relief from that. I mean, that was what I had done, actually, but I had not articulated it as what I was doing. And when he went on and described exactly how that works, it gave me the words to say, okay, this is a technique and I did it. And now I know how to go in and refine it. So it was these goings back in as I got learnings, that also took up some of the time. You had asked me about beta readers. I hadn't mentioned that. In the classes, we workshopped for each other. And then when I finished the classes, by then I had met writers that I was connected to and had become friendly through the classes that I was taking. And so we started meeting in person. I mean, those classes were in person. This was before pandemic. This was, before we were all Zooming and, so we became these tight-knit groups that were, reading and workshopping, editing each other, opining on each other's work. Sometimes just a comment like, I'm not feeling this, or that doesn't work for me, or this conflicts with what I was expecting. Just things like that, but sometimes more. And ultimately, over time, we all found the people that we were workshopping with that to us were more valuable, and we kind of walked off and worked with those people. And it was through one of those groups that someone told me about Joyce Johnson's group, and that's how that whole thing happened. So.
Wow. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Marsha. I know we've gone past our initial time, so thank you so much for sticking with me here. Everything that you've said has been really brilliant, because I think a lot of members here, they want to write memoirs. And so what you provided is, steps that they can anticipate, things that they can do, tips exactly that you've shared. So thank you for doing that. Now, where can our audience find you and find The Wrong Calamity, a memoir?
The Wrong Calamity came out 2 days ago.
Yay!
And actually, I woke up on launch date, day before yesterday. I grabbed for my phone before I even got out of bed. Don't judge. It was release date. And I discovered before I even got out of bed that Publishers Weekly Book Life had named it an editor's pick.
Wow! Congratulations!
Yes, it's a great way to wake up, I will tell you. So anyway, it's now available everywhere. Everywhere you can get books. Amazon has had it available for a long time, ebook, hard copy, paperback. And you can just go on Amazon or any other site where you buy books and search for The Wrong Calamity, and it should pop up. And I'll show you. It's a stripy, multicolored cover like that, but I haven't come upon any other book labeled The Wrong Calamity. So usually it comes up at the top of the search. And any bookstore, now you can walk in, and if they don't have it in stock, they can order it. And so that's very easy. Marsha Jacobson, author. Maybe I would shorten that if I were doing it over again. But Marsha Jacobson, author, is where you'll find me on Instagram. Marsha Jacobson, author, is my my Facebook author page, and MarshaJacobsonAuthor.com is my website.
Awesome. Oh my gosh. So we caught you at the right time. Before all of the other podcasters start rolling in, we got you here. So this is fantastic. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. I was honored when you reached out, and this has really been a pleasure.
Likewise. We're looking forward to what's in the future for The Wrong Calamity, your future works. Wishing you the best. And thank you again, Marsha Jacobson, author of The Wrong Calamity, a memoir. We're super glad to have you.
Thank you, Marsha. Yeah.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of the How to Write a Book podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you want to keep up with me and my work, check out the website, blackheartedstudios.com. That's www.blackheartedstudios.com. And follow me on Instagram at Massiel Writes. That's at MASSIEL Writes. As a book coach and publisher, I'm passionate about helping aspiring authors bring their stories to life. So if you've been dreaming of writing a book and don't know where to start, head to my website and let's chat. You get a free 30 minutes on me. Thanks again for listening, and don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks.